Welcome to Workplace Psychology with Dr. Martha Greidick. I'm Dr. Martha Greidick. This podcast examines a wide variety of work-related issues through the lens of industrial and organizational psychology. And while many of the topics discussed here may be seen as intended for white-collar employees and their employers, in reality, the ideas presented here are applicable across organizations and industries. Additionally, many of the topics discussed here may be applicable outside of the workplace. I encourage you to examine what's presented here, apply what makes sense to you, and simply discard the rest. Most people have heard of a toxic work environment. Some have even experienced it for themselves, and some of you listening may be working in a toxic environment right now. And the characteristics that are associated with a toxic environment, specifically a toxic work environment, vary, and some are more obvious and easier to identify than others. Similarly, some of these characteristics are more problematic than others, and how problematic they are can also differ depending on individuals who are on the receiving end of them, and these characteristics can also change with the passage of time. Suddenly, identifying a toxic work environment may not sound as easy and obvious as it did a few moments ago. Some characteristics that are associated with a toxic work environment include things such as a high turnover rate, when people are hired and either leave or get fired frequently. Things such as a lack of boundaries when it comes to work and non-work domains, and a general sense of mistrust. All of those are potential characteristics of a toxic work environment. The types of relationships that we see at the workplace can be a big clue in terms of the environment toxicity. Unhealthy or inappropriate or disrespectful relationships at the workplace are a big clue that there may be something amiss in terms of how toxic or non-toxic that work environment really is. Other characteristics include things such as gaslighting or a lack of support for employee growth and development. And of course, when it comes to individuals, increased stress as well as increased symptoms that are related to stress are a good telltale sign that the environment in which you work may be toxic. It's important to keep in mind that this is not an all-inclusive list of what makes up a toxic work environment. At the same time, not all of these characteristics need to be present in order for the environment to truly be toxic. And lastly, not everybody has to recognize these characteristics or agree with the toxicity of the work environment in order for it to be true. There's a certain level of individual interpretation that has to be recognized and allowed here. If, for example, you find the environment in which you work to be toxic, but you see little evidence of others sharing that opinion or experiencing the environment in a similar way than you are, it could simply be the case that this is the wrong environment for you. That in itself doesn't make it any less toxic as far as your experience goes. A high turnover rate is one of the big red flags when it comes to a potentially toxic work environment. But it's important to point out that not having a high turnover rate is not in any way a guarantee that that environment is not toxic. People may stay with a company for years, even if they work in a toxic environment, and that may be for many reasons. So to simply say that the environment cannot possibly be toxic because there is not a high turnover rate would be an incorrect assumption. Many people stay in a toxic environment the way that they stay in unhealthy or toxic relationships of any kind. The reasons are varied and vast and oftentimes individual. Some people will continue working in a toxic environment because of economic reasons. They have bills to pay and mouths to feed, and the idea of leaving that paycheck may be simply too daunting. Sometimes people believe that anywhere else they go will be the same, so they would rather stay where they are and forgo having to go through the upheaval of making a big change in finding a new job, only to discover that nothing has really changed in terms of the toxicity of their work environment. So, for those who believe that that's likely the case, it may be just as easy to stay where they are. Sometimes people stay in a toxic work environment because they are bullied by others to do so. They may hear from others telling them that they're being overly sensitive or that they need to get a sense of humor. They're making a big deal out of nothing. Sometimes they may be led to believe that it's not the environment, it's simply them that's the problem. When you hear that over and over again, in some cases, you come to believe it, or maybe just feel defeated enough to stay put rather than leave a toxic work environment. Sometimes people stay in a toxic work environment, especially if there's not a high turnover rate at that company, and they begin to question their own ability to assess the situation for what it is. So even if they identify the environment as a toxic one, they may not see the same assessment from their colleagues, their coworkers, and start to question their ability to correctly form an opinion on that environment and its toxicity. Sometimes you just get paralyzed into doing nothing. It's important to understand that even if you're able to identify a toxic environment, it's not always easy to leave that environment. And there are many reasons, as I already told you, that people stay where they are. As is the case with other situations, hindsight is always 20/20. Once you leave, it's easier to see how bad it used to be. And when you're a third party, it's easy to see things that maybe you can't see so easily when you're in the thick of it, when you're in the middle of that environment. So be careful in terms of being judgmental when it comes to toxic work environments, whether that's towards others who stay in that environment where you think that they should leave, or who don't see the environment as being toxic where you see it as such, or even when it comes to being judgmental against yourself, because when you're in the thick of a situation, it may take a little longer, it may take a little more work, it may take a little more soul searching, a little more assessment before you can actually make a move. So keep that in mind as you look at the environment in which you work or in which your loved ones work. As this episode comes to an end, let's review what was discussed. Workplace environments are a big part of our work experience, and being able to identify a toxic work environment is important, especially if we are to make a change that will be beneficial to us, that will be for the better. Some characteristics of toxic work environments are more obvious than others. Some are more impactful than others. And some of that impact, some of those effects, will vary from individual to individual. One of the biggest red flags when it comes to a toxic work environment is a high turnover rate. But it's important to remember that that characteristic is not necessary to be present in order for the environment to be potentially toxic. Lack of boundaries and things such as mistrust are also characteristics of a toxic work environment. Unhealthy, inappropriate, and disrespectful relationship between people are another big clue. Things such as gaslighting and no support for individual employee growth and development are a red flag. Increased stress levels and the effects of higher stress are another thing to be on the lookout for when identifying whether your work environment is toxic or not. Remember, this is not an all-inclusive list of characteristics of what makes up a toxic work environment. Not all of these characteristics have to be present, and not everybody has to agree in order for an environment to be toxic. Even if the turnover rate is low at a company, that may not mean that the environment is healthy. Remember that people stay where they are for a wide variety of reasons. As the week unfolds, I highly encourage you to take a look at your own work environment. Look at the company for which you work and have an honest conversation with yourself in terms of whether or not you work in a toxic environment and what that means to you if you do work in a toxic environment. The decisions that you make, the assessments that you make can really, truly affect your experience at the workplace. In a future episode, we'll look at how to deal with working in a toxic environment. So please make sure that you stay tuned. If you're experiencing this podcast in an audio-only version, I encourage you to check out my YouTube channel, Stress Free with Dr. G. You will find the video version of the podcast on my YouTube channel. In addition to the podcast, you can find videos that focus on stress management. So I encourage you to check out Stress Free with Dr. G on YouTube. The link for that is in the description below. Thank you for joining me today. Please subscribe to this podcast. I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Until then, I wish you joy and well-being.